In this video, I'm going to try to demystify the conjugation of the verb to be and the verb to be able. Sometimes, because they're irregular verbs, it can seem a little intimidating, but I'm going to try to simplify the process as much as possible so you can determine which forms you have to actually memorize by rote and which forms follow the typical rules of any other regular verb. So as long as you know those rules, you can apply them to this irregular verb. As we go through this process, I am going to show you these principal parts quite a bit because in the end you will find that if you have the principal parts memorized and you have the regular rules for many of the tenses and moods memorized, you'll be able to create those forms of the verbs to be and to be able without having to know any extra tricks or modifications. So let's start with conjugating the verb to be and to be able in the indicative mood. There are no passive forms, so we're just going to be talking about active forms. I should hope that at least the left two columns on this slide are fairly familiar to you. The present tense of the verb to be, sum est sunt, and then the imperfect aram, aras, arat, aramus, aratus, arant were introduced in Latin 1, and we've used them quite a bit. The future tense has only shown up more recently, but as you can see, it follows a fairly regular pattern, and the only tricky part is always remembering what to do with that vowel in the third person plural, but that's always going to be tricky. But memorizing these three tenses of the verb to be should not be too onerous, and some of them, I would hope, have already been memorized by you. In order to conjugate the verb to be able in the same tenses, you just have to know two rules. If the form of to be begins with an S, you are going to add the prefix POS to turn that verb in from to be to be able. So sum by itself is I am. Sum with the POS is I am able. And then if the form of to be begins with the letter E, all you have to do is add the prefix POT. So likewise, S without the POT is you are, and with the POT is you are able. So instead of feeling as though you need to memorize 18 new verbs, you need to memorize two rules. Add POS if the form of to be begins with S, and add POT if the form of the verb begins with E for the present, imperfect, and future tenses. So I'm going to show you these principal parts again, sum esse fui and possum posse patui, because I want you to pay attention to the perfect stems. We've made jokes about the slightly obscene sound of the perfect stem of sum esse, fu, and the perfect stem of possum posse is patu, so obviously they both end in u. And if you have those two perfect stems memorized, you can then conjugate these two irregular verbs in the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect tenses as they follow completely regular rules. As you can see here, for the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, all you have to do is write the stem, the perfect stem, and then the endings follow the 100% regular rules of any verb in the Latin language. So as long as you know the perfect stem, you could conjugate any verb on the planet in the perfect tense, iestiat, imus istis erant, the pluperfect, aram, aras, arat, aramus, aratus, erant, and the future perfect, aro, aris, arit, arimus, aritus, erint. Again, the tricky thing is that here it is erint because we've already used erunt in the perfect. But those are the same endings that you memorized for regular verbs, and all you need to know is the perfect stem of the verb to be and there you have the perfect and pluperfect and future perfect tenses. Likewise, same endings that we have always used for these tenses, and now you just trade in the perfect stem of the verb to be able. So instead of memorizing 18 forms in order to get these verbs down, all you have to memorize is the perfect stems fu for to be and patu for to be able. So we have actually looked at 18, 36, 36 times 2 is 72. We have looked at 72 different verbs when you take the verb sum and the verb possum and you conjugate it in the indicative. But you do not need to memorize 72 different verbs. You need to memorize, in order to conjugate both of these verbs in the indicative, you need to memorize the verb to be in the present, sum es est, imperfect, aram aras arat, and future, aro aris arit. So yes, those are 18 verbs, but they are 18 verbs that you should be fairly familiar with, especially the present and the imperfect. You need to know the POS and the POT rule to convert the verb to be into the verb to be able. So that is a second thing you need to know. You need to know the perfect stems of to be and to be able, patu. That's two more things you need to know. And then you need to know the regular perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect indicative endings. So that's ist it, aram aras arat, and aro aris arit. And the only tricky thing I would say is remembering that for the future form of sum, it's erunt, and for the future perfect ending, it's erint. But if that's the one thing that you keep getting tripped up on, that's not going to sink you. So instead of memorizing 72 distinct verb forms, you basically have to memorize 18 and then a few additional rules, and you're golden for conjugating both the verb to be and the verb to be able in the indicative. So I'm showing you these principal parts again for as we start the subjunctive mood. Again, for the purposes of the subjunctive, you need to know the perfect stems, fu and patu, and you need to know the infinitives. So it's just good to get these 6 words memorized. That they will help you more than trying to memorize individual conjugations in the different tenses. So here I'm giving you to be and to be able side by side, so you can see the transfer from one to the other. These are new to you fairly. We've just started talking about these this year, but it follows a fairly similar pattern. Sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. So that is the present subjunctive of the verb to be. In order to change it to be able, all you have to do is follow the POT rule, and since all of these forms begin with S, all you have to do is add POS. So this is the present subjunctive of to be, and all you need to know to make it to be able is add POS. I'm showing you these principal parts again because I want you to pay close attention to the infinitives, because we know that the rule for the imperfect subjunctive is that you write down the infinitive and you add the personal endings, mst, mustis, nt, and for to be and to be able, there is no difference. So if you've got the infinitives memorized, you can follow the regular imperfect subjunctive rules and you're set. So here you can see the infinitive of to be, the infinitive of to be able, and the regular endings, mst, mus, tis, nt. We've been dealing with those verbs since Latin 1. You just have to remember that M is an alternative ending to O, but again, we've been seeing that a lot. Saw it in the imperfect bombas bot. So, and same thing, if you've got the infinitive memorized, you can add the endings, and that's the imperfect subjunctive of to be able. Here are these principal parts again. We're moving on to the perfect and the pluperfect, so we will be dealing with the third principal part and the perfect stems. But once you have those stems, the perfect and the pluperfect subjunctive behave exactly the same as every other verb in the Latin language. So for the perfect subjunctive for the verb to be, it's fu, and then you almost never see the perfect subjunctive, so the trickiest part about it is just remembering that it's there, but remember that it looks exactly like the future perfect, except for the first person singular. For the perfect subjunctive, it's a rim. For the future perfect, it's a row. Again, if that's the one thing you get wrong here, it's not going to sink you. And then same thing over here. As long as you've got the stem down, it is the same perfect subjunctive endings. And the only tricky thing about it is it shows up very seldom, and it can be confused with the future perfect. But these two verbs behave exactly the same as any verb in the Latin language in the perfect subjunctive. Same thing here with the pluperfect subjunctive. This ISSE plus the endings is a more common, this tense is a more common tense that you come across it quite a bit more frequently. So we've already seen this a lot, but as long as you've got the stem down and you've got the ISSE plus the endings down, both sum and possum behave exactly like every other verb on the planet. So when we're talking about the subjunctive mood for sum and possum, let's talk about what you need to know instead of how many different verb forms. Yes, you need to know how to conjugate the verb to be in the present subjunctive. So sim, sis, sit. That you need to memorize. You then need to know the POS rule. You don't really need the POT rule for this because every form begins with S. You need to know the infinitives. So you need to know esse and posse. You need to know the perfect stems, so you need to know fu and patu. And then you just need to know the regular rules for these three tenses of the subjunctive. Infinitive plus the endings. You need to know the arim, aris, arit. And you need to know the ISSE plus MST. But you already know those because you know how to do that for regular verbs, so you should be able to do that for these irregular verbs. So let's just recap exactly what needs to be memorized and which rules you need to know. The difference between memorizing individual verbs in a conjugation and then knowing the rules should help you kind of manage this. So, yes, you do need to be able to conjugate the verb to be in the present, sum es est, in the imperfect, aram, aras, arat, in the future, aro, aris, arit, in the indicative. And you need to be able to conjugate it in the present subjunctive, sim, sis, sit. So that is 24 verbs you need to have memorized, although they follow fairly regular patterns and you should be pretty familiar with most of them. You need to know the rule that if this form up here begins with an S, in order to convert it to be able, you're going to add POS. If this form up here begins with E, you're going to put the prefix POT, and that is how you take a verb from the verb to be to the verb to be able. You need to have the principal parts memorized because you need to know the infinitive, which is esse and posse, and you need to know the perfect stems, fu and patu. Then you just need to know the regular endings for the perfect tense, est it, the pluperfect tense, aram, aras, arat, the future perfect tense, aro, aris, arit. And then you need to know the rule for the imperfect subjunctive, which is the infinitive plus endings. And then you need to know the endings for the perfect and the pluperfect, arim, aris, arit, and isem, isses, iset. I know that seems like a lot, but you have much of this already memorized. It's just a matter of systematizing it in your mind and making sure anytime you need to do anything with the verb to be or to be able, you jot the principal parts down off to the side so you can consult them. If you do that, you will find a lot of success in conjugating these two verbs. If you'd rather look at this visually, you can see here the forms of the verb to be that you actually have to have memorized. You can see where you're going to use the POS or the POT rule. And then each of these yellow boxes means that the verb to be and the verb to be able, although they are officially irregular verbs, follow the regular rules. and all you need to know is, in these instances, the perfect stems, and in this instance, the infinitive. So if that helps you to visualize it a little better, you may use this chart to refer to.